So Dell's gaming lineup for 2023 looks very interesting. I'm a huge fan of the G series now, especially with those brand new color designs. I think they look very clean. It looks classy. The fact that they're actually gaming laptops, I think a lot of people are going to be very impressed with the look of these things because most gaming laptops are kind of aggressive. These are taking the opposite approach. They're actually making gaming laptops look a lot of fun. But today we're here to talk about the Alienware X14 and the X16. I have a love-hate relationship with the X14. I always thought it was one of the most unique looking 14-inch premium notebooks you could buy, but I always felt it was overpriced for the type of specs that you got inside of it. Now granted, this year they're obviously increasing the specs, they're adding a few new things, but overall, from a design standpoint, it's pretty much the exact same laptop as last year. It's still using a CNC aluminum chassis. Instead of having a 14 over here, this is last year's model obviously, they're placing an X, and it's still gonna weigh around 4.95 pounds. It's not the lightest 14-inch notebook, but definitely one of the most unique designs. Now the port lineup is gonna be identical to last year, so 2 Type-C ports. One of them is Thunderbolt 4, the other one is not. You have a micro SD card slot, USB 3.2 Gen 1, HDMI 2.1, combo jack for audio, and of course it's gonna be using a 130 watt power brick via USB Type-C. Now the big difference between the X14 and the X16, besides the size, is that you do get a couple of additional ports with the X16. The X16 is gonna have its own power connector port. It's gonna have an additional USB Type-C port and an extra USB 3.2 Gen 1 port. Besides that, the design is going to be very identical. It's just gonna look like a bigger version of the X14, but you do get a lot more RGB. There's gonna be RGB around the rim over here that you can completely customize. You're gonna have RGB on the keyboard, which is gonna be using micro LEDs, so you can customize each key to whatever you want. And the touchpad on the X16 can be changed to different colors. Now, the one thing I've always appreciated about the X14 is its build quality. Like, this hinge is nice and stiff. The actual laptop feels like a Dell XPS 15 merged with a gaming laptop, so it feels solid overall. The keyboard deck is gonna be identical to the previous model, but the shaping around the edges will be a little bit more standard. Like, you're gonna have lines over here and more of a honeycomb shape at the top. Of course, the keyboard will be RGB and you can customize it to whatever you want, but the difference is with the X14, the travel distance is only 1.2 millimeters. If you've typed on a Dell XPS 15 or 17, that's exactly how the X14 is going to feel like in 2023. The touchpad is a little wide, but it's very, very tiny because of this chassis. I will say though, with the X16, you're getting a better keyboard, 1.8 millimeters of travel distance, and it's actual mechanical. Like, you can type on it, you're gonna get that clicky sound. It's gonna be much better for gaming. Now the X16 is obviously heavier, it's over 6 pounds, it's a bigger laptop, it's obviously gonna be geared towards someone who wants a bigger display for gaming, but even potentially content creators. But the one thing that's very interesting is that they're moving the Alienware lineup, at least the X14, to a 16:10 display. Last year's model was 16:9, and I think by moving up to that 16:10 aspect ratio, especially on a 14-inch laptop, it's just gonna make the display feel a bit bigger. You're gonna get a 1080p webcam. It's gonna support Windows Hello using facial recognition. This goes for both models, and you finally have the option to spec it with QHD. There's a few different versions of it. All of them support G-Sync. This goes for the X16 as well, but you can either spec it with QHD or Full HD. There's options for 240 Hertz. I think there's a Full HD option that goes over 400 Hertz, or you can get it with a QHD panel that supports up to 165 Hertz. There is no mini LED option on either of these laptops, which seems to be kind of a miss since its competitors are starting to use mini LED in their lineup. So here's my issue with the X14. I think it's gonna be the same problem we had last year. For the price, you can only push this thing so far in terms of specifications, especially when you compare it to the competition. Like, you can only buy this with an i5 13420H or an i7 13620H. This version of the i7 processor has less cores than the regular i7 13700H. You're getting 10 cores instead of 14. So the same amount of performance cores, but the efficiency cores are being slashed in half. You can still pair this with an NVIDIA 40 series GPU. You can buy it with a 4050 or a 4060, which will both run at 85 watts, but they even still offer an RTX 3050 which will run at 45 watts. Now granted, if you do buy the Alienware X16, you're obviously going to get more powerful options. You can still get it with the 13620H, but you do have access to the i7 13700H and the i9 13900HK, which both have 14 cores to be utilized. Now if you do go with the RTX 4050, 4060, or 4070, with the X16, that will run at 140 watts. But if you go with the 4080 or 4090, that's gonna run at 175 watts. Now granted, I do like the fact that the X16 is coming with a GAN charger. So if you do buy the 4050 to 4070, you're gonna get a 240 watt power brick. It's gonna be smaller than most power bricks because it's using GAN technology. But if you do opt for the 4080 or 4090, that charging brick is gonna be a bit bigger at 330 watts. The other thing to look out for is actual sound quality. Now both laptops come with Dolby Atmos, that's standard, but you do get more speakers on the X16, 6 speakers to be utilized with 2 tweeters that are upward facing. Now performance is really hard to determine on the X14, but it's obviously going to be slower than the upcoming G14 or other 14-inch gaming laptops. But I will say that the X16 will be able to hold its own. These new Intel CPUs will be getting a nice performance bump compared to last year. As I mentioned in previous videos, you're looking at a 10 to 12% single core clock speed improvement and anywhere from a 30 to 40% multi-core speed improvement. It really comes down to the type of applications you're using, but it will give the GPU more headroom when you're pushing all these demanding titles. Now the X16 is interesting because it's not using an HX processor, so it's not going to be able to compete with the Razer Blade 16 in terms of CPU performance, but the GPUs on the other hand are running at the exact same TGP. Now I don't know what thermals and heat management is going to be like on these laptops, but I'm expecting the X14 to perform identical to the previous model. It's still going to be using a vapor chamber plus a smart fan to cool the components. The X16 on the other hand doesn't use a vapor chamber for the GPU options that are below a 4080. So if you buy the 4080 or 4090 version of it, you will get a vapor chamber cooling solution. Now granted, none of these laptops have upgradable RAM, and this is kind of very, very disappointing because I think at least the X16 should. This is a bigger laptop. People are going to be keeping these things for a very long time, and upgradable RAM ensures that they can be using it for longer. Both of these products will have Element 31, which is Alienware's version of liquid metal on both the CPU and GPU. But the battery life is going to be a bit different. With the Alienware X14, you're using an 80 watt-hour battery, whereas the X16 gets the bigger 90 watt-hour battery. Not so much the legal limit of 99, but it's pretty close, and I think for a thin and light laptop like that, that's probably the most they could squeeze inside. So here's the thing, I'm happy that Alienware now has an X16 version of their X14 because, you know, there's a sea of thin and light gaming notebooks, and this design has always been one of my favorite. But the problem is I think they're gonna have the same issue they did with last year's X14, and that's trying to justify the cost when performance on its competitors are more for a price that's usually lower. Like, don't get me wrong, these are beautiful and they're light and they look great, but at the end of the day, people want the best value. And I feel like the G14 or even the M16 are gonna offer a bit more for a lower price point. Either way, I'm gonna save my full judgment for the full review, so make sure you subscribe to see that. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.